welcome back to Medieval Art. We're here with our Fellowship of Curators to discuss more visual details of Rings of Power. And I think this week we all had really fascinating thoughts about Lindon. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to John, maybe to talk a little bit about Lindon's architecture, the interior-exterior architecture.
Thanks, Larissa. A few episodes ago, we talked about how excited we were to see more of Lindon. And I think now, we started to see some more scenes. It's interesting. Last episode, we saw the building of Celeborn's tower and the sort of cityscape that it's in. And yet, aside from Celeborn's study, we haven't had any built interior scenes in Lindon. They've all been set in the natural world. And this week we had the scenes with Gilgalad, the dining scene, all taking place in this sort of grove of trees that to me looked very much kind of almost architecturally built, like a hippo-style hall from Temple at Luxor or the Great Mosque at Cordoba, up to Gothic cathedrals, and even modern Scandinavian architecture is doing a lot with sort of interior columns and glass walls set in a forest so that you feel like you really are bringing the outdoors in. And yet this is a millennia-old architectural style, and we see this reflected in Lindon. Sarah, I think you were also in the Lindon camp.
Yeah, I also, thanks, John, really picked up on Lindon and the feeling of the space in the setting, particularly in the banquet scene. And what really struck me was the kind of closeness of the trees around this setting and how it creates this kind of almost flattening effect to the background, which reminded me a lot of illustrations by the Danish illustrator Kay Nielsen, who viewers might be familiar with from a number of illustrated books like East of the Sun and West of the Moon, but also from things like Fantasia, the Disney animated film. So that really struck me. And it just kind of got me thinking more about animation and its impact on the realms of fantasy. And I know that's something Larissa and Brian explored a lot in their exhibition, The Fantasy of the Middle Ages. And I hope that in future episodes of the Rings of Power, we maybe see some cues being taken from the stylization and experimentation that can be done with animation versus the idea that something has to look naturalistic. I mean, I think the other members of our fellowship were also drawn to some of these elements, and as well as details like clothing and jewelry and things like that. So I'm not sure who wants to jump in next.
I'd actually love to jump in there and say something about Arondir's armor and the kind of connection to nature and connection to trees, especially, that is so evident in the architecture and the kind of look and feel of Lindon, is something that's also coming out even when the elves are away from Lindon. And I was really struck by the kind of green man motif of Arondir's armor and how sort of textured and kind of bark-like it is, and how different that looked from Galadriel's armor, which was very smooth and sort of perfect in its shine and kind of overall appearance. And Diva, I know that you were also really interested in some of the jewelry and kind of more armorial and clothing details that we saw this week.
Yeah, thanks, Larissa. I was really interested in this incredible leaf shirt that you have on Elrond. And I was also really interested, which is, again, more elven, natural, organic motifs. And I was also really obsessed with these gorgeous pearl, kind of bejeweled hairnet headpieces that the two elves had on during this Lindon dinner party. And I went looking for a reference and kind of found that this is an Art Deco, an Art Nouveau kind of headpiece you might find with like a flapper, but it's sort of an exaggerated, fanciful version, of course. And I think that and the kind of leaf shirt are just more examples of elven clothing matching this organic environment and being very oriented towards the organic and the natural, meaning sort of plant life. The pearl headdress, I thought the kind of way that they dripped down were sort of mirroring an organic environment, and also the sparkling light that you see kind of permeating all elven environments. Everything's perpetually a little bit sparkly. And I also thought that a massive table, and this is kind of a story that we get, the mini story in the episode around that, was interesting. Sophia, did you want to comment on that? Because I thought your comments were really interesting.
Yes, thank you, Diva. The entire banquet scene, in fact, I thought was so great. It reminds me of like 17th century paintings of banquet scenes with gods and goddesses around the table, because they're usually depicted in a forest. The stone table itself, the idea that the table comes like from the earth, this work of art, just taken from earth itself, from earth's resources. I thought that was incredible. I also want to point out Durin calling out that this particular stone table came from their minds, and basically calling out the elves of returning it. It speaks to repatriation issues that we are today looking at in the museum world.
I thought that was such an interesting point to think about, because it is, even though he's, later reveals it to be sort of a joke, which is great, classic dwarf like humor, right? But I think the point is made that there's certain materials that are off limits, probably to dwarves and probably to other, Middle Earth cultures as well. And so I thought that was, yeah, like you said, something that's quite parallel and facing art historians and curators in the present day. These things like ivory or other problematic materials that we can't really show in good faith.
I also thought it was interesting that he, even though it turns out not to be the case, Durin implies that the stone is only used for very special purposes, like funeral monuments. And I thought the idea of using these kinds of particular materials to signify certain levels of importance or significance, just by looking at them, I thought was really fascinating, and something you see kind of all through art history, this kind of use of materials that carry even kinds of inherent power themselves. And I thought that was really fascinating. And as we are looking at different jewels and different metals kind of across Middle Earth and in Numenor, especially with the use of kind of gold and gem encrusted costumes and headwear, this kind of idea that all we need to do is see a particular kind of material and we know where we are and kind of who we're dealing with. And we were commenting earlier on Muriel's extensive costuming and especially her selection of headwear. And that kind of reminding us a little bit of Byzantine or even ancient Babylonian kinds of costumes, and the way that it kind of falls down around her face to frame her face always kind of like a moving portrait in a way.
I also really like the fact that we can tie it into these larger, deeper storylines that we find throughout Tolkien's legendarium. So jewels and their place and who actually can claim ownership over them is central to so many of the stories, particularly in the Silmarillion. But who actually owns the Silmarils and who is responsible for them is one of the causes for so many of those plot lines. And then we have later examples like the Nauglamir and things like the Arkenstone and the Hobbit. So these precious materials and who can claim them as their own, and the complicated issues with that, I think ties in nicely with the points that Sophia was making about repatriation.
And it's sort of nice to see that coming to the fore again with Mithril and the questioning of like, how do you safely delve and mine for this material? Should you? And ultimately, the problems of delving too deep and what you release from the earth that should never have been touched. And so this sort of play between using the material world and the dangers of using the material world. I like how they're kind of bringing this out.
Yeah, I think that's a really recurrent theme, obviously, in all of Tolkien's work. But I think what's really fascinating is the way that this mithril discovery has almost a corrupting effect on Gil-galad in a way that, we know so many resources and their quote unquote discovery have had over the centuries in Europe and around the world. And this sort of like, there's this idea that if we just have this one material, if we just get this access to this one material, then everything will be solved, And so there's a sort of sinister kind of mithril grab that we're seeing, and it's just really a story about resource extraction, and so yeah, it does layer on to how we see different materials and material culture in the show.
Going back to what we were talking about, sacred materials and their uses, I wonder the idea of mithril and the elven light and the sacred use of that. The storyline is departing a little bit from the legendarium, but I find it fascinating. That's how they're going about it with the use of mithril.
All right, thank you all so much for those comments. We're delving even deeper into the material culture of Middle Earth and of Rings of Power, and join us next week for even more details, more conversation about all the different things that we're noticing in the Rings of Power. Thanks again.